Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk general aviation with relevant news and flying tips for pilots and student pilots like you to help keep you safe. I'm Max Truscott. Today we'll be talking about the amazing Garmin G3000 and G5000 glass cockpits, and about my new book that can help you master those systems. Plus later we'll talk with inventor Nick Sinopoli about his new smart hood for instrument training called the ICARUS device. In episode 182, we talked about everything you should know about pilot reports or PIREPs. So if you didn't hear that episode, you may want to check it out. And before we get started with the news, I'd like to just ask for your help for one moment to help grow this show. Please take a moment now to look at whatever app you're listening to us on and find the share button. And then send this app to a friend who you think might benefit from the show. And then follow up afterwards with him or her and suggest that they follow or subscribe to the show. Thanks so much for your help. This week in the news, the FAA has a new document out outlining how to do a self-weather briefing. And a popular aircraft from the 1930s and 40s is headed back into production. And finally, we'll tell you the amazing story of a pilot who was recently found 36 days after he crashed. All this and more, and the news starts now. From AOPA.org, a new FAA AC on how to conduct a self-briefing. A strong preference has emerged among pilots to get pre-flight weather briefings on computers or devices instead of calling flight service. To help pilots help themselves, the FAA has released a new advisory circular and an online course as guides to the briefing process. According to the advisory circular AC 91-92, the FAA recognizes that the majority of pilots have become more accustomed to performing a self-briefing than to calling an FSS, and it acknowledges that a self-briefing may be compliant with current federal aviation regulations. What makes a briefing regulatory compliant? Well, it must satisfy FAR 91.103, which requires that each pilot in command shall, before beginning a flight, become familiar with all available information concerning that flight. If there is one disadvantage do-it-yourselfers may face, however, it is the lack of structure for the briefing compared to a briefing received from an experienced flight service specialist. The advisory circular and the online course, for which credit is available to participants in the FAA's Pilot Proficiency Wings program, the aim is to level the playing field. They review the three types of briefing a pilot would request as the proposed departure time for a flight nears, and they break down each briefing type, Outlook, Standard, and Abbreviated, into its components. The information to look for in each of those components is also analyzed with links to online sources also provided. The online course, Conducting Pre-Flight Self-Briefings for Student and VFR Pilots, is hosted on the FAA Safety Team website and uses scenarios and real-world examples to provide guidance on, quote, how to conduct a safe and regulatory compliant pre-flight self-briefing using automated weather resources. The objective is to ensure that the pilot understands aviation weather basics and learns to apply meteorological and aeronautical information in a systematic manner to plan a safe flight. Section 7.7 of the advisory circular discusses the benefits and limitations of weather and aeronautical information pilots can access electronically in the cockpit, noting that it can help pilots plan more safe and efficient flight paths and make better strategic decisions during flight to avoid potentially hazardous developing weather. It also describes the many services transmitted automatically to equipped aircraft by the FIS, or Flight Information Service, FIS-B component of ADS-BN, while reminding pilots that information received through FIS-B may not include all of the weather products or NOTAMs that a pre-flight briefing includes. And the story was also covered on iPadPilotNews.com, and they say, pilots are creatures of habit, and many continue to follow their instructor's advice from decades ago that an official weather briefing had to be obtained from flight service to be legal, and a self-weather briefing was not legal. AC 9192 sets the record straight once and for all with updated guidance for pilots on the role of flight service. It says, the FAA considers that a self-briefing may be compliant with current FARs. By self-briefing, pilots can often improve their knowledge of weather and aeronautical information. Flight service personnel are available should a pilot need assistance. Not only are you not required to contact flight service prior to a flight, but the AC recommends using flight service as a consultative resource on an as-needed basis. Quote, pilots are encouraged to utilize online automated weather resources to conduct self-briefings prior to contacting flight service. Pilots who have pre-flight weather risk assessment and risk mitigation skills are better prepared to make in-flight decisions as real-time weather information is consumed. This allows flight service to become a consultative resource that can be utilized when needed. From flyer.co.uk, that's Flyer Magazine, the Luscombe 8 back into production as an LSA, which would be a light sport aircraft. And just a quick note, if you're unfamiliar with the Luscombe, they built nearly 6,000 aircraft between 1933 and 1950. The legendary Luscombe 8F is to go back into production initially as a light sport aircraft, but with the ambition of building certified aircraft constructed to USA CAR 4A standard airworthiness requirements. A new Luscombe Aircraft Corporation has been created by Steve Testraki and Stephen Young, who acquired the Luscombe assets in June of 2019. They say their goal is to revive the legacy of the Luscombe. LAC is operating from a 25,000 square foot facility at Jamestown Airport in Chautauqua, New York. The two owners said, "We are now starting the Luscombe LSA Model 8 production. We had several discussions on pricing and are keeping the cost as low as possible." Steve Testrowski engineered and designed a new retro dash. We've digitized several thousand drawings and started making parts for the new LSA. LAC says it has committed significant resources to sorting, inspecting, and cataloging our parts inventory. Quote, "We have worked extensively to develop a digital archive of Luscombe's large collection of historical records, engineering drawings, and production work orders. We have inspected and are refurbishing production jigs and tooling to resume production of those hard-to-find parts." LAC is working closely with numerous well-known suppliers and manufacturers to establish an FAA-approved supply chain. It says, "We are now working with Trig Avionics to design factory new and aftermarket modification kits that will allow owners to upgrade their cockpits with modern equipment, including ADS-B transponders and ELTs, while maintaining the look and feel of the classic Model 8 cockpit. Additionally, we're developing close working relationships with the local metalworking specialty shops to leverage their rich western New York and North Pennsylvania manufacturing base. LAC is offering maintenance assistance by the use of the factory tooling to Model 8 owners who desire to restore their airplanes using the original Model 8 production tooling." And there's a graphic that says that the simplest version they're offering is legal to fly day VFR with no radios and has a base price of $110,550. Top speed is 140 miles per hour. It has two 12.5-gallon fuel tanks for about 4 hours of flying with a 45-minute reserve. From CNBC.com, United Airlines to open a flight school later this year in hiring push, plans to increase diversity. Now, you may recall that in episode 181, Jason Blair told us that the major U.S. airlines would resume hiring this year, and now here's a story that suggests that that's moving ahead. United Airlines started accepting applications for its Flight Academy as part of a push to hire 10,000 pilots by 2030 as more of its aviators reach the federally mandated retirement age of 65. The airline announced in February 2020 that it bought a flight school, but the COVID pandemic forced it to put training plans on hold. Last week it said it will start hiring pilots again, starting with 300 candidates whose hiring process was halted by the pandemic. United's flight school is meant to provide training to pilots with little to no experience. United says it wants to train 5,000 pilots. It aims for half of them to be women and people of color. Just over 7% of United's more than 12,000 pilots are women, and 13% are people of color, United said. The first class of 20 pilots will begin in the third quarter, with a graduation date sometime in the first half of 2022. United and other airlines have ramped up pilot recruitment in recent years. Students will be able to apply for United's Aviate recruiting program, which extends conditional job offers to candidates as they build up experience during training and working at smaller carriers. It could take a student about 5 years from starting flight school until reaching a job at United. United declined to say how much the Flight Academy would cost students, but it said it would fund $1.2 million in scholarships to break down the financial barriers that limit access to the airline pilot career path for generations of women and people of color. J.P. Morgan Chase said it will provide another $1.25 million in scholarships to help increase diversity. And from flyer.co.uk, again, that's Flyer Magazine in the UK, a 50,000-pound prize for human-powered cross-channel race. The top cash prize of 50,000 pounds is being offered to the winning team of the Great Human-Powered Aircraft Race, due to take place in June of 2022. A further 10,000-pound prize will go to the second fastest team and 5,000 pounds to the fastest female pilot. The first and only crossing the channel in a human-powered aircraft, or an HPA, was 42 years ago by Brian Allen in the aircraft Gossamer Albatross, designed by Paul McCready. No successful attempts have been made since. The race will mark the 60th anniversary of the first flight of human-powered aircraft by Derek Peugeot in the Southampton University student aircraft, the Sumpact. Crossing the English Channel on a human-powered aircraft has been done once before, barely, said Eric Proudfoot, an HPA designer. It was one of the most amazing athletic achievements of our time. To think that several international teams are going to attempt the same feat on the same day in a race to see who was the fastest seems almost a bit bonkers. It will be a huge technological and logistical challenge, but most of all a supreme test of athletic and piloting skill. It's going to be fascinating to watch and thrilling to participate in. Entrants will have to fly 35 kilometers from Folkestone to France. All aircraft will take off on the same day to ensure no team has an unfair advantage due to weather, though takeoffs will be staggered to ensure that there are no mid-air collisions. Teams will be followed by speedboats with rescue divers standing by in case an aircraft ditches. On account of the risk and difficulty, teams will have to demonstrate past experience in HPA building to qualify, said the organizers. Teams from all countries are invited to apply. And just for the record, I won't be applying to be a part of this race, but it does sound like fun. From FlightGlobal.com, an A380 caused conflicts after wrong turn during go-around. Pilots of a Singapore Airlines Airbus A380 incorrectly acted on a turn instruction during a go-around at Sydney Airport, that would be in Australia, of course, turning left instead of right and creating conflicts involving other traffic, investigators have determined. The aircraft had boarded an ILS approach to runway 16 right at about 1,000 feet owing to wind shear as it arrived from Singapore last year. ATC acknowledged the go-around and instructed the aircraft to turn right onto a heading of 270 and maintain 3,000 feet. But the crew had been expecting a left turn in order to avoid weather and traffic to the west of Sydney and believed they heard an instruction to turn left. The first officer, who was the monitoring pilot, gave an incomplete readback, said the Australian Transport Safety Bureau, adding that the controller missed this opportunity to correct the misheard order. By turning left, the A380 crossed the approach path of the parallel runway 16 left. The controller queried the aircraft's course and told the crew to turn onto a heading of 060 degrees. The A380's maneuvers resulted in its coming into conflict with a Bombardier Dash 8 on approach to 16 left, the crew of which was instructed to make a right turn to maintain separation from the jet. This in turn resulted in a loss of separation between the Dash 8 and a Boeing 737, which had been approaching 16 right, the minimum distance reducing to 2.6 nautical miles horizontally and 1,300 feet vertically. Investigators state that the A380 crew was experiencing a significantly higher level of workload owing to the weather conditions and the go-around due to wind shear. The missed approach procedure required the crew to reconfigure the A380 in less than a minute, and the pilots did not expect to receive an ATC instruction, one which was contrary to expectation, until the procedure was completed. These elements probably contributed to the misheard instruction, the inquiry says. It adds that incomplete readback, in the absence of correction, will be perceived by most crews as implicit confirmation. And I'd like to just add that this kind of expectation bias is also an issue for GA pilots, because sometimes we hear what we expect to hear and not what was actually said. Now, we rarely talk about eVTOLs on this show because there are probably 100 companies working on these aircraft and none have made it to market yet. But this week we have two significant stories about eVTOLs, so we'll talk about them. From CNBC.com, UPS agrees to buy electrical vertical aircraft to speed up package delivery in small markets. UPS is taking package delivery to new heights, literally, with the purchase of 10 electric eVTOL aircraft from Beta Technologies. Atlanta-based UPS said it will test the eVTOLs for use in its express air delivery network, focusing on small and medium markets. The company will operate the eVTOLs under its Flight Forward division, which is also exploring drone delivery. The new type of aircraft, which looks like a cross between a plane and a helicopter, unlocks new business models that don't exist today, Bala Ganesh, VP of the UPS Advanced Technology Group, said. For example, you can see a future where it's carrying, let's say, 1,000 pounds, 1,500 pounds to rural hospitals and landing on a helipad instead of an airport. Vermont-based Beta Technologies will design and build the eVTOLs, which are set to be delivered to UPS in 2024, pending certification from the FAA. Beta will also provide landing pads and rechargeable batteries. UPS holds an option to purchase up to 150 more eVTOLs. The price of the transaction was not disclosed. The eVTOLs can fly up to 250 miles at 170 miles per hour on a single charge. UPS said it initially plans to use them in smaller markets and create a series of short routes or one long route to meet customer needs. The eVTOLs will have an operational advantage over small airplanes, according to Ganesh, because they're designed to accommodate shipping containers, which allow for faster movement of packages in many cases. Beta Technologies founder Kyle Clark said his team has worked with UPS to help transform how the company handles moving packages. And from TheVerge.com, Wisk Aero accuses rival flying taxi firm Archer Aviation of brazen theft in a new lawsuit. Wisk Aero, which is a joint venture between Boeing and Kitty Hawk, is suing rival air taxi firm Archer Aviation for allegedly stealing its trade secrets and infringing on its patents. Wisk is seeking unspecified monetary damages and an injunction against Archer to prevent it from using the allegedly stolen technology. In response, Archer says it has no reason to believe that it possesses any of Wisk's intellectual property. In a complaint filed in the U.S. District Court of Northern California, Wisk said it is suing Archer to, quote, stop a brazen theft of its intellectual property and confidential information and protect the substantial investment of resources and years of hard work and effort of its employees and their vision of the future in urban air transportation. Most surprising to Wisk was the design of Archer's prototype aircraft, mainly because it closely resembled Wisk's own prototype. Both aircraft feature 6 front rotors, each with 5 blades that can tilt either horizontally or vertically, as well as 6 rear rotors that each consist of 2 blades and remain fixed in a vertical position. Archer's aircraft also includes an unconventional V-tail shape, similar to Wisk's patented design. Archer recently made news by raising $1.1 billion by going public through a reverse merger with a special acquisition company, or a SPAC. The merger was valued at $3.8 million. United Airlines has placed a $1 billion order for 200 Archer electrical vertical takeoff and landing, or eVTOL aircraft, with an option to purchase 100 more for $500 million. A spokesman for Archer called the lawsuit regrettable and denied the allegations that the company had stolen Wisk's intellectual property. Analysts predict that the flying taxi market could grow to $150 billion in revenue by 2035. And just an aside, I do indeed hope that the analysts are right and it becomes a $150 billion market, as that would create a lot of jobs. Though I'm a little skeptical that the market will be that big. After all, it was only about 15 years ago that analysts were predicting that VLJs, or very light jets, were going to be so popular they would darken the skies with dentists, and obviously that never happened. And finally, here's something that did happen. This comes from the NewYorkTimes.com. It says his plane crashed in the Amazon, and then came the hard part. The pilot was 3,000 feet over the Amazon, flying a small propeller plane on his maiden assignment for wildcat miners deep in the forest, when the engine cut out. He had about 5 minutes, he calculated, to bring down the plane and its highly flammable cargo, 160 gallons of diesel fuel. He reported his imminent crash over a portable radio, noting he was about halfway to his destination, a mine known as California. Then, as his plane barreled down, Antonio Sena aimed for a small valley lined with palm trees. There, he recalls thinking, palm trees mean there is water, perhaps a river. Since becoming a pilot 9 years earlier, Mr. Sena had heard countless stories about fatal crashes. But while his plane scraped a few trees and then smashed into the ground, he realized something exhilarating as he rolled to a halt. He had survived. He grabbed a pocket knife, a flashlight, a couple of lighters, and a phone with a little juice in the battery, and scrambled away from the aircraft. Moments later, it burst into flames. Then he settled down to wait for his rescue. It was a long wait. At first, Mr. Sena recounted in a phone interview last week, he camped out next to the remains of the 48-year-old Cessna 210L, figuring it was his best chance of being spotted. And search pilots did in fact circle the area for several days, and then kept going. They flew right over me but couldn't see me, Mr. Sena said. He waved and screamed each time he heard the thud of propellers, but to no avail. Giving up his hopes of being rescued, Mr. Sena embarked on what turned out to be a 17-mile trek through the rainforest, home to jaguars, venomous insects, and anacondas. 36 days later, on March 6th of this year, he emerged to tell a story that has transfixed Brazilians, a rare piece of uplifting news for a nation badly in need of it after a year of being battered by the COVID crisis. His account, though, also put a spotlight on Brazil's illegal mining industry, which has flourished in recent decades in indigenous territories and other parts of the Amazon that are supposed to be sanctuaries. The illegal mine where he was headed was in the Maicuru Reserve, where no human activities are allowed beyond those meant to protect the forest. Mr. Sena's ordeal began on January 28th at a small airstrip in Pará State. His task, he said, was to ferry diesel fuel for miners in a remote region where they had built a makeshift landing strip. It was work he took only reluctantly, he said. Flying gigs had become scarce during the pandemic, and a small bar he ran was providing little income. After his plane crashed, when it became clear help was not going to come from the sky, Mr. Sena, 36 years old, started walking. He knew that predators usually hunt near the water where prey is abundant, so he slept on hills. But he was frequently besieged by packs of spider monkeys which tried to destroy his precarious shelters. The monkeys, however, were a godsend. After watching them eat a small bright pink fruit called brew, that's B-R-E-U, Mr. Sena assumed it was safe for human consumption, and it became his main source of sustenance. One afternoon, about 4 weeks after the crash, when he had gone through 3 days without eating, a buzzing noise stopped him in his tracks. A chainsaw. Mr. Sena had stumbled onto the campsite of Brazil nut collectors. Reflecting on his ordeal, Mr. Sena said he walked away with a newfound appreciation for the rainforest, which is being raised every day by the illegal miners he briefly worked for. If I had fallen somewhere in a deserted plantation site, I wouldn't have water, shelter, or anything to eat, he said. The Amazon is so rich. Well, that's the news for this week. Coming up next, we'll talk about the Garmin G3000 and my other weekly updates, and later with Nick Sinopoli about the ICARUS Devices Smart Hood, all right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And now let's talk about the G3000 and G5000 glass cockpits from Garmin. Many of you may be familiar with the Garmin G1000 and Cirrus Aircraft's version of it called the Perspective and later the Perspective Plus. Now, the G1000 first came out way back in 2004, and 2 years later I wrote my Max Truscott's G1000 and Perspective Glass Cockpit Handbook, which is now at its 5th edition. That book has done extremely well, and if you fly either the G1000 or the Perspective and you'd like to know everything there is to know about these systems, and you'd like to read about it from a book that's been written by a pilot for pilots, then I'd strongly encourage you to get a copy of my book. The G1000, of course, is used in many piston aircraft and a few light turboprops in light jets. Now, the G3000 and G5000 are similar to the G1000 in that they are glass cockpits. However, they are even more capable than the G1000, and get this, they are actually a little easier to use than the G1000. And if you haven't heard of the G3000 and G5000, it might be because you're not yet flying a turboprop or light jet, as you won't find these systems in any piston aircraft. But if you've ever used a Garmin GTN 650 or 750 navigator, then you already have some familiarity with these systems, as those navigators share some of the same software as their big brothers, the G3000 and G5000 glass cockpits. The biggest difference between the G3000 and G5000 is that the former is designed for smaller, lighter Part 23 aircraft, and the latter is designed to meet the more stringent Part 25 regulations, which apply to the design of larger aircraft, including the transport aircraft used by the airlines. Now, fortunately for pilots, the user interface for the G3000 and G5000 is virtually identical, since the systems share much of the same software code base. And one of the most amazing things to me about the G3000 and G5000 is how many different kinds of aircraft they are used in. For example, you'll find one version of the G3000 in the single-engine Cirrus Vision Jet that I fly. But you'll also find a version of it in the F-5 fighter jet. And if you're thinking the F-5 has been around for a long time, how did they get the G3000 in it? Well, you're asking the right question. And the answer is that a company called Tactical Air Support, or TAC Air, has a fleet of about 20 F-5s, and they've recently upgraded them with a Garmin G3000. TAC Air is a defense contractor, and they use the F-5s to fly in adversarial support roles. You'll also find the G3000 in turboprops, such as the TBM 940, which is the fastest single-engine turboprop on the market. And recently, Joby Aviation announced that they will use the G3000 for their revolutionary all-electric vertical takeoff and landing, or eVTOL aircraft, which is expected to begin commercial operations in 2024. The G5000, which looks virtually identical to the G3000, can be found in business jets such as the Cessna Citation Longitude, which is the top of Cessna's product line. It carries 12 passengers at flight level 450 at 483 knots. It's also used in the Cessna Citation Latitude and Cessna Citation Sovereign Plus. And even some older jets now sport the Garmin G5000, as there are retrofit programs that let owners put the G5000 in older Cessna Citation Excel and Citation XLS jets and into the Beechjet 400A and the Hawker 400 XP. And it's also found in some out-of-production aircraft, including the Learjet 70 and 75 and the Citation 10 Plus. If you're wondering how one glass cockpit could be used in so many very different types of aircraft, one answer is that the G3000 and G5000 are offered in at least 3 major configurations. Most implementations use a version with 3 large displays across the top of the instrument panel, which includes 2 PFDs or primary flight displays for each pilot, and then a larger single display with MFD-type information such as maps in the center between the 2 PFDs. In addition, most of these aircraft have 2 smaller touchscreen controllers located below the displays, and these are used for almost all user inputs to the system. Now, this common 3-display configuration is used in the Cessna Citation M2 and CJ3+, the Embraer Phenom 100 EV and 300E, the Honda HA420 Honda Jet, the Learjet 70, 75, and 75 Liberty, the Piper M600, and the Daher TBM 930 and 940. Some G5000-equipped aircraft also have a 3-display version that has not 2 but 4 touchscreen controllers. Aircraft with this configuration include the Cessna Citation Latitude, Sovereign Plus, Longitude, and 10 Plus. A 2-display version of the G3000 with a PFD, MFD, and 3 smaller touchscreen controllers is used in the Cirrus SF50 Vision Jet. I'm guessing that Cirrus opted for a 2-display version to reduce the total size of the avionics, which gives pilots a better view as they look outside. And this is undoubtedly one of the meanings of vision in the aircraft's name. Also, I'm guessing they expected most of these aircraft to be owner-flown with a single pilot, so there's less of a need for a second PFD sitting in front of the right seat. There is also a single-display version of the G3000 that combines a PFD and moving map onto a single display. It's teamed up with 2 touchscreen controllers, and it's targeted for tactical aircraft with tandem seating. Announced customers for the single-display version include TAC Air's 20 F-5 fighters, the Diamond Dart 550, which is a tandem 2-seat civilian and military turboprop trainer, and the Textron Scorpion jet. By the way, in the F-5, which has tandem seating, each pilot has 1 display and 2 touchscreen controllers. In all of these many configurations, user inputs for the MFD-type functions, such as maps and charts and so on, are performed on the smaller touchscreen controllers. By contrast, PFD functions are performed through soft keys, which are located along the bottom of the PFD displays, except in the Cirrus Vision Jet, where those functions are also performed with the touchscreen controllers. In the TBM 930 and 940, PFD functions can be performed with either the soft keys or the touchscreen controllers. The G3000 and G5000 use touchscreens for almost all user inputs, unlike the G1000, which uses physical knobs for user inputs. The touchscreen controllers used in most G3000 and G5000 implementations are oriented vertically and include a joystick. By contrast, touchscreen controllers used in the Cirrus Vision Jet and in the TBM 930 and 940 don't have a joystick. So the methods of zooming and panning maps and charts vary among aircraft depending upon whether or not they have a joystick. Therefore, pilots who fly more than one G3000 or G5000 equipped aircraft will sometimes need to interact with the user interface in different ways to access the same function. Also, some functions are not available in all aircraft. Now, one of my challenges in writing this book was accounting for the different configurations in different aircraft. As you can imagine, readers would like to be able to go directly to relevant information for their aircraft and not have to wade through information that's only relevant to other aircraft they're not flying. So to make it a little easier for readers to identify that text descriptions appropriate to their aircraft, I created several different icons for each of the major configuration types. Thus, as you're reading the book, you can easily identify information that's relevant to, for example, aircraft with 3 displays and 2 touchscreen controllers versus, say, the Vision Jet and TBM configurations that use horizontal controllers. I also took great pains to include images for virtually every software screen you might encounter when using the G3000 or G5000. So there are nearly 400 images in the book, and to get these, in some cases I used a software simulator, and in many cases I took photos while flying in different aircraft with clients of mine. And if you buy the book, you'll find that all of these images are in color. Now in my G1000 book, only some of the pages are in color, so many of the images in the book are black and white. And that did reduce the production cost of that book, but a few readers were unhappy that not all the pages were in color. So with this latest book, I decided to print everything in color and charge a little more for the book. By the way, I would like to thank Stephen Elop, who's one of our Patreon mega supporters, for taking a photo in his Citation CJ3+, which became the cover photo of the book. And he's in that photo. And over the years, a lot of people have assumed that I'm in the cover photo of my G1000 book, but that actually is Dan Vivoli sitting in his Cessna 206, which we flew back together when he picked it up new from the factory. By the way, I first learned the Garmin G3000 while doing my type rating in the Cirrus Vision Jet at the Vision Center in Knoxville, Tennessee, almost 3 years ago. And I had the same experience learning that system that a client of mine, who I was talking with about this recently, had when he first started using the G3000. Both of us had used the G1000 for many years, and most of the functions you'll find in the G3000 and G5000 are the same functions I've been using in the G1000 and Perspective for over 15 years. But the user interfaces in these systems are very different from each other. So initially, while I am an absolute whiz when using the G1000, I struggled a lot with learning the G3000, probably because my brain was so wired for using the G1000. And initially, I was not happy with my struggles to learn the G3000. But over time, I have come to absolutely love the G3000 and G5000. And the reason I love them so much is now that I know how to use the system well, it really takes me less time to perform a function on the G3000 than it does in the G1000, even though I've got literally thousands of hours of experience behind the G1000. And I make fewer mistakes on the G3000 and 5000, which also saves time. The biggest difference, and I really want to thank the many developers at Garmin for this, is that with the G1000 and with the Garmin 430 and 530, almost all user inputs are made with a pair of concentric knobs. And the challenge with these knobs is that they perform two very different functions depending upon whether or not a cursor is present on the display. If the cursor isn't present, the knobs are used to navigate the many pages of information in the MFD, but if the cursor is present, those same knobs are instead used to manipulate data on the screen you've selected. And so on the G1000, people often make mistakes because they haven't first looked to see whether the cursor is on or off. By contrast, most of the switching between MFD pages and the manipulation of data is done by touching buttons that appear on the touchscreen controllers in the G3000 and G5000. And that just takes less time than twisting knobs, and you no longer need to first look to see whether a cursor is present or not, as you did with the G1000. Of course, no system is perfect, and there is one funky thing you need to do when interacting with the G3000 and G5000, and that is regardless of whether you have 2 displays or 3 displays in your aircraft, those displays can be split vertically so that you have essentially 2 different unrelated panes of information on a single display. So for example, you might split the left display, which has PFD information displaying your primary flight instruments, so that in addition to showing the flight instruments, it also displays an instrument chart or maybe a checklist or even a map. So as you're flying along, you might have 4 separate panes of information controlled by the touchscreen controllers, but in most G3000 and some G5000 implementations, you only have 2 touchscreen controllers, and they can only control 1 pane at a time. So before you start manipulating the data on a pane in the G3000 and the G5000, you first have to verify which pane a touchscreen controller is currently controlling. And if it's not the pane you want to change, you need to first use the touchscreen controller to select the pane you desire before you start making inputs. Otherwise, you'll end up changing a different pane from the one you had intended to. But this minor amount of forethought you need to do before changing a pane is much, much easier than identifying a small cursor on the G1000 and deciding whether to turn it on or off. And just like the G1000, in the G3000 and G5000, there is often more than one way to accomplish a particular function. So in both systems, I've spent a lot of time comparing different ways to do things and have tried to figure out the fastest way to perform a function. So even if you already have G3000 experience, you'll learn some of those shortcuts from the book. Also, like my G1000 book, I've consulted with some of the top CFIs around the country to learn their favorite tips, and you'll find those liberally sprinkled throughout all of the books, including this latest one. And even if you're not yet flying a plane with a G3000 or G5000, you may be interested in reading the book and learning about this new system. By the way, many of the features of the G3000 and G5000 are also in the Garmin GTN 650 and 750, so if you fly with those systems, large portions of the book are also relevant to you. The book sells for $44.95, and you can order it online from me directly by going to maxtruscott.com, and of course I'll put a link to it in the show notes. Or you can order it from me by phoning 800-247-6553. You'll also find the book in stock in some other places where you may go to buy aviation supplies. By the way, it took me about 2 years to write and produce the book, and as hard as it is to write a book, it's even harder to get the word out about a book to people who might be interested in it. So let me ask you this small favor. If you have a friend who flies a G3000 or G5000 equipped turboprop or jet, please tell your friend about the book. Or better yet, please buy them a copy of the book and give it to them as a gift. Thanks so very much with your help with this project. Coming up next, our conversation with Nick Sinopoli about the ICARUS device, right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And now let me tell you a little bit about Nick Sinopoli. He has a BS in aerospace engineering from Purdue University. He's currently an air assault pilot flying helicopters for the Army National Guard. He founded ICARUS Devices in 2014 when he had an idea for a radical new design for hoods used in instrument training. He calls this smart view-limiting device the ICARUS device. Now here's our conversation with Nick Sinopoli. Well, Nick, welcome to the show. Great to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Max.
Well, tell us about the moment when you kind of realized that maybe someone should design a better hood. What was that catalyst, that moment of inspiration?
Well, it was born out of frustration. I was walking away from the helicopter. I had been on a IFR training mission, and I was under the hood. It had just taken off. I was outside of Pensacola, and the instructor swiped the cyclic right out of my hand. We went very hard left. Him and the observer in the back started debating whether or not we almost hit a bird or a plane, and I was sitting there a bit startled in the right seat. And it turns out we almost hit a buzzard over Peter Prince Airport there in Pensacola. And we came back around, we shot an approach, we landed, and it was a near miss. I almost took the buzzard into my lap. It came inside the rotor arc on my side. And at that time in 2014, the Boeing 787 Dreamliner was coming out. And the 787 does not have window shades in the cabin. It has electrochromatic windows that you just hit a dial and it changes opacity. And I thought to myself, if Boeing aeronautical engineers can figure out how to put that in a passenger airliner and do it 100 times and make it cost effective and fire resistant and weight effective, why am I still flying a helicopter with a piece of paper? And I got my pilot's license. We just used foggles, and they were a pain. So initially, I just wanted to be able to see outside. And I got a piece of the PDLC film and tried it out and was messing around with the electrical connections and realized that it kind of looked like going in and out of clouds, and that the light bulb went off, and here I am a few years later with more of a finished product.
That's awesome. Tell us about some of the limitations of a traditional hood or view limiting device like foggles.
So the first one is that it's binary. It's either on or off. There's no in between. You're going to know that it's coming. It's cumbersome in the cockpit in that, if you're doing instrument training, you got to transition at decision height or the MDA. So you got to take it on, take it off. That was another pain point that I had found with our paper foggles that I used when I was learning to fly a helicopter. The other one is that the visual fidelity is not there. It does not look like clouds. And one thing that I've found in my research and working on this project for a while is it is crucial to make sure that you're not getting peripheral cues when you're flying the aircraft. You're not going to get those in a cloud, and it's a massive training scar, especially in the civilian helicopter industry, but also in aircraft. I was just out on the East Coast with a flight school owner. he was telling me about, training people on multi-engine aircraft. And he's like, well, to do commercial maneuvers, we're out on the East Coast. Sometimes we get layers. So we got to punch through the layer to get VFR on top to do our maneuvers. And he was like, you wouldn't imagine how many pilots that are, commercially rated, instrument rated pilots, and they get into the clouds and they don't have much instrument. They have instrument rated, but not a lot of actual instrument time. And they get all wonky and it start losing control. And, sometimes the instructor has to take the controls, and it's not anything about necessarily the pilot. It's that they have this massive training scar of these hoods and foggles that we've been using since 1929.
Yes, I still remember my experience with foggles, and that was 30 years ago, and I was wearing glasses at the time. Now I have contact lenses, except for my readers that I have on here at the moment. And I remember those things would fog up, especially on humid days. And just today, I was flying with a gentleman with foggles, and he said, oh, my foggles are fogging up. And, the other thing about traditional view-limiting devices, I don't think I have ever seen one where I wasn't getting some view of the ground peripherally. No matter how good they are, it just seems like you still see some of the ground going by.
Yep. And, I've taken great pains to cut the film of the ICARUS device to specific cockpits. Our general aviation, the great thing about light single engine training aircraft is they're approximately about the same sitting in there looking out, and there's some adjustment built into the device. But in the helicopter industry, you sit in a Robinson R44 and the panel's very small. You sit in a Bell 429 or an EC 145 or something like that, and the panel's very big. And each one's a little bit different, but it's crucial to make sure that you're not getting those cues, because you're not going to get those in clouds. And we've already seen with our beta testers and the pilots that have already trained with the device that there's a noticeable difference in the quality of training and the quality of pilot that produces.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that I remember my instrument training, and with the foggles, I could do it, and then I would be totally freaked out when we were in actual. To me, wearing foggles is just a totally different experience. Yeah,
and one of the things I usually tell people is that it's not that hard to keep an aircraft, say, straight and level just on the instruments. What's really dangerous is the transitions. You're transitioning, you're accelerating, you're decelerating, you're climbing, you're descending, you're turning. So one of the things about traditional foggles is that you have to put them on. So you're not usually going to be controlling the aircraft, and maybe the instructor takes controls, and you're going to be trimmed out. And you never want to give somebody an untrimmed aircraft. So with ICARUS, it's designed to be worn from start to finish, and much more natural transitions, like you're actually going to get in the cloud. So you get to decision height, and hey, suddenly you can start to see the runway, or you're popping in and out of clouds, going through layers and stuff like that. So it's all about that scenario-based training and bringing that to the aircraft.
So go ahead and describe for us the ICARUS device, and for those who are watching the video, go ahead and show it to us.
Awesome. So there's three components to the device. The first is the PDLC visor. So I'll demo the fixed wing device. Now, based on beta testing, we wanted something that was as simple, light, and portable as possible. So we've come up with a non-rigid design that works with any old baseball cap. So it clips to the end of the baseball cap, like so. And then it fits around to give it the shape of the cockpit. Then it connects to the second component, which is the controller and the battery pack, which has 8 hours of full clear. And then you can transition. The third component is the Bluetooth-enabled app that works on any iPhone or Android or your iPad, and allows you to switch between visibility levels, set transition times. It'll even track your IFR time, which is, there'll be no more wondering about how many hours you actually got.
That's great. So as I'm looking at you initially, it looks like I can see pretty much straight through the glass. So when it's powered to be clear, how clear is it? I mean, are you able to see 5-10 miles with it?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. There's a little bit of, you can see the edges of it, but after a while you're going to forget that it's on, which is the goal, really, especially when we talk about inadvertent IMC training. And it allows the instructor to set different visibility. So one of the big things is we can simulate marginal visibility, which kind of plays into the goal that we're giving that instructor a tool to teach weather decision making, which is a huge, huge problem because, how many times when you're getting your private pilot's license, are you the one making the weather call or in-air weather calls? Or we're sitting there, you're doing IFR training, and you can sit at the table and your instructor can quiz you about, hey, what weather do I need to do this approach, or what are my minimums, and so on and so forth. But there's two facets to that. There's pre-takeoff weather decision making and in-flight weather decision making, which, to be honest, the more important one is in flight.
And what are the different visibility levels that you can set? Are they preset, or can you customize them? And how many levels can you choose to have to switch back and forth between?
So we have 4 levels, and 3 of them are adjustable. So the first level is a VMC safety. The transition time is instant, and that will make the device go perfectly clear. The other 3 levels are set at a mile, half a mile, and then less than half a mile. And what we tell people is that corresponds to 100, 75, and 50% opacity.
Well, that's interesting. So do I understand that you could actually go for basically a zero visibility setting where you really can't see at all except the instruments?
Yep. So at the 0 level, you're not really going to be able to see outside.
Got it. And then for transitions, I see that you could set it so that it very gradually starts to clear. And how long could you set that for? You mentioned 30 seconds as an example.
0 to 30 seconds, and that's going to also transition between levels. So depending on how you set the levels, you could stretch that out. We also have a demo mode that will go just automatically in and out to teach. One of the things we talk about in looking at accident reports especially is that we want to train pilots to commit to instruments instead of trying to hold on to VMC too long, because that's where we see a lot of the spatial disorientation, CFIT, and loss of control accidents.
Yeah, so when I think of a traditional hood, I think of it being used strictly for instrument training. It sounds to me like you're saying there are a whole lot of other ways that it could be used as well, both with private pilots who aren't instrument rated and with anyone, just to kind of simulate going into the clouds accidentally. Is that right?
Exactly. So everybody knows on your private pilot, 40 hours, you need 3 hours of simulated IFR time. Now, for me, when I was getting my pilot's license, we were going from San Marcos back to Austin, and we just got done practicing landings. Like, you're going to spend the majority of your time learning how to fly. And, it was always throw the foggles on, we'll log 0.3, and you'll be that much closer to hitting all your boxes to get your private pilot's license. Now, the intent of those 3 hours was not to make instrument-rated pilots or not to give anybody, a taste to get them to get their instrument rating. It's to give them a fighting chance if they found themselves in inverted IMC. And we're doing pilots a disservice when we just say, here, throw on the foggles and it's another check in the box. Because, always consistently one of the top killers in general aviation is inverted IMC and spatial disorientation and pilots that are in non-IFR rated aircraft or non-IFR rated themselves getting into IMC. So the goal, especially for general aviation, is to train better instrument pilots, but also train better private pilots that instead of that, hey, throw these on and we'll log our, 30 minutes while you're straight and level. Hey, let's go out and do turns around a point or something like that and practice maneuvers. And after they've gotten comfortable wearing the device, start to play with the visibility and start taking it down and get them to start saying, hey, I'd probably start looking for an airport to land at, or, I'd be changing up my route of flight and I'd be looking to divert or going through the motions and maybe giving them that invert IMC scenario and letting them practice, hey, you punch in invert IMC, the first thing you need to do is get the aircraft under control and focus on that 100%. You turn away from known obstacles, you're going to have to climb. And then you're going to have to, set your transponder to emergency. You're going to have to call up approach or some other agency. You have to get some help to get that aircraft on the ground and start running through those scenarios so that if that time comes, that pilot doesn't just have, hey, I saw 178 seconds to live. I saw that video and now I'm very scared that I'm going to die. Instead of that, they have training to fall back on.
Yeah, I can see how this would be even more practical than running them through an inadvertent IMC checklist that essentially says, put on the autopilot and make a 180. Here they actually get to see it. And if it's kind of given to them as a bit of a surprise, then you can see, hey, do they know to go to the checklist, or are they just kind of late to make the decision? Are they struggling with what to do?
Yeah, and it's definitely something that, I spend a lot of time telling people I want it to be like an engine failure. When you're learning to fly either a helicopter or an airplane, you're going to sit there and the instructor's going to pull the engine back. And what do? Well, you got to, hit max glide. You got to auto rotate if you're in a helicopter. You got to find that field that you're going to put it down in. And if you ever got to it, hopefully that muscle memory would take over and, you put yourself in a good position. So I think the key to reducing the accident rate for weather-related accidents in this country is better training, simple, and better pilots, not necessarily just, whiz-bang tech features on the aircraft or on an iPad.
So tell me, how long have you been working on this and perfecting the device?
So I had the original device idea in 2014 in September. I built the first real working flyable prototype in early 2015, in January 2015. And actually took it up to Purdue and rented a Cessna and flew around, made a little video, and that got me into the Aero Innovate program at EAA Oshkosh. So I went up there that summer in 2015 and kind of went all in. I sold my car to get the patent and have been, struggling ever since to make it a reality. And we've been through quite a few different models, done a lot of beta testing. I'm very thankful that Purdue, Ohio State, a lot of helicopter flight schools, and I've had the right people, very experienced pilots, help me out and help me along the way to get to where we are right now. So this is the fixed wing device, but I'll show you the helicopter device can go either to our NVG mounts on our helmets or onto it, and it's got carbon fiber and there's a little bit more real estate. So it's been a journey from idea, and it's been an engineering problem that I never saw myself, tackling. I went to school for aeronautical engineering to design, airplanes and that type of stuff. But life has a funny way of taking me on a different direction.
Once an engineer, always an engineer. I know that you have been working with a lot of flight schools and individuals and driving around giving demos and things like that. Tell me about the feedback that you've gotten from people who've used it.
So I'd love to sit here and tell you that everything was, all the feedback was great, but nothing good comes without struggle. So I get a lot of feedback on some of the GA stuff is if a pilot has had a few hours of hood time, the device is much simpler to fly with when you're actually up flying. There's no change the controls. There's no take the foggles off. It doesn't pinch you around your ears like foggles. You don't look like a dog that just came back from the vet with a big gray hood or anything like that. But it does take a little bit more setup. There's a cord. It's a very small battery pack. So initially, some pilots are like, "Hey, I don't know about this," but they get a few hours and they're like, "I never want to go back." I've learned a lot of feedback, and one thing about building the device is I'm not the person to test it because I built it, so I know how to use it. So I have to hold my tongue sometimes, and I just want to hand it over and tell me what you think. I remember one of the first big beta testing comments I got back. I had made some new controllers, and I had been using something that was off the shelf, and it had like a little belt clip on it. And I hand over these, specially 3D printed controllers. And I hand it over, check this out, and it's like, "Where's the clip?" And I was like, "What do you mean, where's the clip?" And he's like, "The other one had the clip." He's like, "I need the clip." And what I found out was he had been clipping it to the seatbelt to keep the cord up and away. And I had never thought about that. And now, guess what? Every ICARUS device, it comes with a clip attachment. So you can put it to either your flight suit or your seatbelt.
And who do you think is the biggest target market for this? Is it individual pilots, CFIs, flight schools? Who do you think it's best suited for?
So, I just sold a device out to a private pilot, instrument-rated guy who, flew a couple hundred hours a year in a 172, and he just wants to be the best instrument pilot possible. And especially if, you're going to be taking your family on trips and stuff like that, you want to be proficient, you want to be the safest pilot possible. So I think that's probably, by numbers, our biggest market. There's 300,000 instrument-rated pilots in the United States. There's 100,000 CFIs. So CFIs, it's a bit of I think it's a moneymaker for flight schools, and especially in this market, it pays to be the best, and you want to attract your students, and just like you want to have nice, clean airplanes and professional CFIs, you want to have the best tools possible because those IFR students are coming in and investing $20,000. You want them to choose you, so that's the selling point for them for ICARUS. So that's obviously a large market between the CFIs and the flight schools, but also the private guy that just wants to be proficient because you got to log your 6 approaches, and you got to stay proficient and current, and ICARUS can definitely help you do that.
Well, obviously this device is a lot more expensive than the traditional hoods, but it's probably the only electronic hood that's out there. Tell us about the pricing for it.
So right now we just launched, and I've been bootstrapping this company. So the pricing right now is $1,500 for the helicopter device. There's a bit more components to it, and $1,000 for the GA fixed wing device. And I get a lot of it's not a $20 set of foggles, and people think it's a direct comparison between the foggles and this, and that's not my competition. My competition is poor instrument proficiency and a high accident rate. So the end goal is that a safer population of pilots is cheaper to insure, and it pays to be proficient. And I really haven't met a lot of pilots that are cowboys, and nobody wants to be a dangerous pilot. Everyone wants to have takeoffs equal to landings. So the competition really is the accident rate, not what we've been doing since 1929. I'll never be never be a $20 device, but at the same time, if you're out there paying, hundreds of dollars to rent an airplane or to fly your own airplane with an instructor, with your safety pilot buddy, and you want the best. And this is definitely the best.
Well, and I think years ago, nobody would have believed that we routinely pay $1,000 for headsets, and yet a lot of people do that. So it may not be that outrageous.
Or, I've got a sectional on my wall. How often do you see a guy actually pull out a sectional and, I'm going to go fly with that? No, you fly with the $1,000 iPad that has, subscription electronic flight bag. And it's kind of a similar thing. They're both maps, but you get a lot more functionality out of electronic flight bag than you do a piece of paper.
That's a really excellent comparison. Well, Nick, thanks so much for spending time with us here today. Where do people go to find out more about you and about the ICARUS device? ICARUSdevices.com. So instrument conditions, awareness, recognition, and understanding system, devices.com. That's super. Nick, thanks so much for spending time with us here today.
Thanks, Max. Take care.
And my thanks to Nick Sinopoli for making time to talk with us. I always enjoy stories about entrepreneurs, as without them, we just wouldn't have many of the innovative new products that we enjoy using today. You can find out more about Nick and the ICARUS device at ICARUSdevices.com. Coming up next, a few of my updates right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And now for a few updates. Last night I was driving home and I was listening to episode 10 of the Mayo Clinic Clear Approach podcast, which is hosted by Dr. Greg Van and discusses medical issues for pilots. And he was talking about new guidance that's just come out from the FAA if you have had COVID-19. And the good news is if you've had a mild case, you can probably get your next medical issued by your local AME that you go to for your FAA medical. But if you've had a more severe case, especially if you were hospitalized, there are going to be more hoops that you're going to have to jump through, and you may not be able to get the medical directly from your local AME. So if you've had COVID and you are due for an FAA medical, you may want to check out this episode before you go to your appointment. And of course, I'll have a link to it in the show notes. Let's talk briefly about headsets. I think I mentioned that I started teaching again a couple of weeks ago, and I typically fly 600 to 700 hours a year, so my headsets get a lot of use. And what I've found is that every few years, the soft material on the ear cup starts to flake off, and I can usually tell when that starts to happen by the black dandruff that I see on my white shirt after I take off my headset. And so that's when I know it's time to order replacement ear cups for my headset. So I did that again, and in my case, I use headsets from Lightspeed, and my primary headset is their Zulu 3. I also have two other Lightspeed headsets I use, mostly for the first lesson or two with a new student pilot who doesn't yet have a headset. Ordering the ear cups was easy. I just found the phone number for Lightspeed and reached the person who took the order. Their package of consumables includes 2 new ear cups and a pad that cushions the top of your head from the headset. All 3 items quickly snap into place. When they arrived, I had all the pieces installed within just a couple of minutes. Also, they include 2 foam wind screens that slip over your headset's microphone. If you've ever lost one of those pieces of foam, you know how important they are, as your microphone will pick up a lot of annoying noise in the cockpit if you don't have that foam in place. So if you're finding that your headset ear seals are getting worn, regardless of what headset you use, you might want to think about ordering replacements for the ear cups. Also, another thing about headsets, I made an interesting discovery a week or so ago that I wish I'd figured out a year ago. This may apply to you if you either wear sunglasses during flight and or if you're wearing a face mask in the cockpit. I always forget the name of that part of the sunglasses that extends back from the lenses and rests on the top of your ears, so I just had to go look it up again. Those folding arms of your eyeglasses or sunglasses are called temples. And usually when you're flying and wearing a headset or sunglasses, the temples of your sunglasses end up under the ear cups of your headset. And unfortunately, the temples do a good job of breaking the seal of the headset's ear cups. And of course, the seal of the ear cup around your ear and against the side of your face is an important factor in how quiet your headset is going to be. So long ago, I figured out that in order to keep my headset quiet, I needed to raise the temples up so they didn't rest on my ears, but instead were under the very top of the headset seals or even above the headset seals. That does tilt the angle of your sunglass lenses a little bit, but not so much that I've ever found it to be a problem in the cockpit. I'm still wearing a mask when I'm teaching in the plane, and when I was flying recently, I noticed that the airplane noise I was hearing with my headset on seemed louder than usual. And that's when I finally realized that those thin little tiny strings on the mask I was wearing were doing exactly the same thing as the sunglasses. They were breaking the seal of the headset ear cups. But the strings of the face mask are so thin, it never occurred to me that they would be big enough to break the headset seal. Yet they did. So I made a quick fix that those of you wearing masks in the cockpit might want to try. Instead of looping the mask strings around my ears as I usually do, I first put on the headset, and then I looped the strings around the outside of the headset ear cups. And that simple little trick made my headset as quiet as it always used to be. When taking off the headset, I reversed the process and unlooped the mask strings from my headset, removed the headset, and then put the mask strings back over my ears. It's a simple little fix, but now my headset is much quieter in the cockpit. And my thanks to Dan Henderson, who emailed me an image of a windsock calibration sheet. As he correctly points out, this is not something that's discussed much at all in pilot training or anywhere for that matter. I remember hearing years ago that windsocks at the airport were calibrated, and brand new windsocks are produced according to the guidelines of ICAO, which is ICAO. This means that all current models are calibrated to be fully inflated, that is, sticking straight out, at wind speeds of 15 knots or more. Now, it turns out that you and I have been using the wrong name for the windsock all these years. The FAA gets it right. They refer to the windsock as a wind cone, and they say that the wind cone will be fully extended at 15 knots or 17 miles per hour. Now, I knew about the maximum speed of the windsock, but I didn't know about the intermediate stripes on them. A lot of windsocks have 5 stripes. If you have a 3-knot breeze, that's apparently the minimum required to turn the windsock around so that it's into the wind, and that first stripe there indicates a 3-knot breeze. If the second stripe is elevated, sticking straight out, then you're at about 6 knots of winds. If you have 3 stripes straight and level, then you're at about 9 knots. If the 4th stripe is also up, then you're at 12 knots. And finally, when all 5 stripes are horizontal, you're at about 15 knots. And if the windsock has blown off its attachment, then you probably shouldn't be at the airport. That tells you that things are pretty bad. Now, the FAA does have a specification for wind cone assemblies. Who would have thought? It's an advisory circular 150/5345-27E. And of course, I'll include a link to it in our show notes. And of course, to get to the show notes, you can either find them by swiping one way or the other in whatever application you're listening to us on, or just go out on the web to aviationnewstalk.com/183 for episode 183. And I want to share with you this message from Patreon supporter Greg Van. He says in his email to me, I wanted to thank you for the information about winding the clock, which we talked about in a recent episode as the first step in an emergency, which basically means you need to stop, collect your wits before you respond to the emergency. He says, with the COVID pandemic, life has been moving so fast in healthcare that it has been hard to slow down at all over the past few months. So the recommendation to stop and take a breather before responding to situations was well-timed and received. I ended up using this in the real world right after the start of my private check ride. After the instructor got in and I pulled up my checklist, the first thing I did was take a deep breath and wind the clock, which was actually the first time I had touched the old clock in the Piper Archer I was in. It helped me calm down immensely and ultimately, I think, helped me pass my test. So, Greg, thanks so much for your email and congratulations to you on passing your private check ride. So what would you pay for an hour of excellent flight instruction? Well, you might want to consider signing up to be a Patreon supporter like Greg. It's easy to do. Just go out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome, enter your credit card, and choose how much you'd like to donate each month. Or you can make a one-time donation by going out to aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal, and you don't even need to have a PayPal account to do that. Just enter your credit card. And I do want to thank the several new supporters who joined us this past week. We have 3 new mega supporters, and I'll probably botch the names here, but I'll get them correct next time. Dave Broshi has supported us at $100 a month level. Chris Carnahan, a longtime supporter, has edited his pledge up to $50 a month. And Kent Mazia has edited his pledge also up to $100 a month. And I'll tell you more about these 3 new mega supporters next time. And Greg Williams edited his pledge up to $20 a month, and Michael Scott is a new Patreon supporter. And now here's our honor roll of mega supporters. Those are people who donate $50 a month or more, and I mention their name once a month. And after 2 months, they get one of my books for free. Those mega supporters include Brian Deere, who lives in Northern California, recently moved to Texas. He has a Turbo 206. Mark Souza, he's a student pilot flying in a 152 at the Chicago Executive Airport, and he's getting close to his private check ride. Tyson Wisk, we've had him on the show here, co-founder and CEO of ForeFlight. Bruce Dickerson, he's a financial planner living in Georgia and flies a K-35 Bonanza. Dave Broshi, who I just mentioned. Victor Vogel, who lives in Central PA and flies a Cirrus. Tim Delaney, he's a wealth manager in Santa Rosa, California. He flies an SR20 out of the Santa Rosa airport. Stephen Elop, who I mentioned earlier, he's on the cover of my G3000 and G5000 book. He flies a Turbo 182 and a Citation CJ3+, and he's the CEO of API Jet. Mike Williams, who I just heard from, he's the president of TCB Composites, maker of composite spinners and bulkheads for GA aircrafts, and he flies a Cessna 172. Seth Lake, he's a DPE in Arkansas, gives check rides. He also specializes in giving multi-engine training, and you can check him out at vsl.aero. Rick Miller, he's a CFI in the Cincinnati area. He teaches both out of the Lunken Flight Training Center as well as to private owners of Piper, Cessnas, Beechcraft, and Cicadas. He says he'd love to teach full-time, but he still has that day job for a few more years. Justin Winters brokers real estate on Lake Kiowa in South Carolina and flies an SR-22. Carl and Ann Rossi of Maine Cooncat Aviation. They have 2 Cessna T-240 aircraft and a Piper M350 on order. Johnny McDade, he's a singer-songwriter, musician, and record producer. Jim Goldfuss is flying out of Republic Airport on Long Island. He's training for his CFI and II, and he's giving ground school at Pilot Proficiency International. He can be reached on his Facebook page of Ground Point 9 and is available for individual instruction in person or online. Charlie Mason flies out of Austin and is working on his instrument rating. Vincent Salimi, Vice Mayor for the City of Pinal, California. He's the owner of Salimi Construction Management in San Francisco, and he's also president of the Concord Flying Club. Jim Hopp, he's a CFI I've flown with. He teaches at Advantage Aviation at the Palo Alto Airport. Joseph Sheehan, who I just mailed a book out to. He flew in the Navy for 8 years and now has a few hundred hours in his new Vision Jet. Josiah Freeman, he's working on his instrument rating. Dylan Caldwell, he's an AME in Florida at the Naples Municipal Airport, so if you need a basic med second or third class flight physical, you can find him at aviatorsclinic.com. William Birch donates to the show in the memory of his son, Lieutenant J.G. Wallace Birch, who was a naval aviator. Don Hakela with Professional Instrument Courses. They conduct 10-day instrument courses, IFR finish-up, and IFR refresher courses. You can find them at iflyifr.com. Don Dillman is a professional pilot who runs an airline flight department. He's also a CFI and flies a Bonanza. Rick Mattis, an owner of PointWise, which makes computational fluid dynamics simulation software used by aerospace companies. They're at pointwise.com. John Tosto lives in Flint, Michigan, and flies the 4 planes for rent at the Greater Flint Pilots Association. He also co-owns a Cherokee 6. Mark Holzbach lives in southwestern PA. He's a longtime aviation enthusiast who wants to get his private when he retires. He runs BoddenSteel.com, which makes industrial fasteners. Tim Crawford flies a DA-40 out of Crosswinds Aviation at the Oakland County Airport north of Detroit. He runs a company called BrainSpring that helps children with dyslexia. Greg Van, he's the senior AME at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, and host of the Mayo Clinic Clear Approach podcast, which discusses medical issues for pilots. James Kerr, who's thinking about buying an SR22 for business travel. He has a company that makes security screens for protecting your home, and you can find out more at bosssecurity-screens.com. Orel English, he's a CFI and double I at the Westchester Flying Club at Westchester County Airport in New York. He and friends have created a website to make free flight planning modern and fast. The site is called Flyway, and you can check it out at flyway.cc. Ed Kelly flies a Saratoga out of Mount Pleasant, South Carolina, and says his 2-year-old son Bennett is the best co-pilot he could have. Jeff Brausch, who I just sent a book to. Michael Ron, who also just got a book from me. He runs a small wealth management firm in Woodland, Texas. You can find them at The Sum, that's S-U-M, planning.com. He's thinking about buying a Cirrus. Todd Kussel lives in Arizona and flies an SR22. And Chris Carnahan, who I'll tell you more about next time. And as I mentioned earlier in the show, please take a moment right now, stop what you're doing, and share this episode with a friend. Just click the share button on whatever app that you're listening to, and then follow up with them and ask them to either subscribe or follow, depending upon the app, Aviation News Talk. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up.